Today, we're going to be looking at what is possibly the most impressive, biggest, and best Warhammer box of all time. So yeah, we're not going to be talking about Dominion. I recently found a secondhand copy of the Warhammer Fantasy 5th Edition Starter Kit for what seemed like a really great price of 150 Canadian dollars, or about $50 US. And so, without further ado, is this the best Warhammer starter set ever? Probably not, but let's take a look anyway. First of all, the guy I bought this from threw in a few extra bits he had lying around, including some old paints I may try to save someday, a knife, some paint brushes, and most excitingly, an old white dwarf from the time, and a couple of old Games Workshop catalogs. I've already had a ton of fun leafing through these to see all the old minis, and will undoubtedly spend way more in the coming weeks. As for the box itself, it is gorgeous. And by gorgeous, I mean ugly as hell. The old school Warhammer art is just so over the top and ridiculous, and I just adore it. It jumps out at you and just makes you want to grab the box. And once you open it and take a look inside, other than a single Saurus missing, it looks like everything else is here, including a fair bit of paperwork, dice, some punch cards, and a whole pile of models. So putting all that aside, let's first look at the rulebook. So I was on vacation for the first time in ages last week, and I took the time to do something I've never done before. Read an entire wargaming rulebook from front to back. But before talking about its content, I wanted to talk about its quality. I was really surprised to see that the entire book is in full color, which helps to show off all the glorious 90s Games Workshop photography and artwork. It's so garish, kitschy, and campy, and I just love it. However, it does seem like the writer and the formatter had some kind of joke or animosity going, as a lot of the time the rules will refer to an image or something somewhere else on the page, but it's never there. It may well be on another page entirely. As for the rules, like any Games Workshop release, there is a lot in here. They do have a little getting started manual, which was very helpful, but we'll be focusing on the main rulebook, which is actually shorter than most recent ones at only 112 pages. And that length has more to do with additional things being left out than the depth of the rule set itself. Also, it's important to note that between not having a completed Warhammer Fantasy army and the ongoing plague, I haven't actually played any 5th edition games, or any Warhammer Fantasy games for that matter, so we'll just be going over my impressions of the rules so far. It would take forever to go over everything in here, and would honestly just be pretty boring. So I just wanted to highlight certain things, both negative and positive, that really jumped out to me. First of all, I really like some of the rules around special units like war machines and monsters, and particularly love the rules for flying creatures, as doing things like removing them from the table completely to represent them circling high in the sky is a fantastic idea that I feel would really elevate a lot of other games. There's some other great things here too, but also some more mixed stuff as well, like the rules for buildings, for example. A lot of the rules around buildings feel way more comprehensive and functional than a lot of other rule sets I've read, particularly when it comes to destroying them. But the details about entering and fighting around them feels fairly obtuse to me, and really comes across as an obligatory thing that they were required to include rather than something the designers were actually excited about. But the biggest thing to talk about is the rank and file system, as that's what really sets classic Warhammer Fantasy apart from other Games Workshop games. I've still never played a rank and file game system, that being a game when the units are specifically organized in rigid squared off groups, and that mainly comes down to me finding most rule sets for them convoluted at best. Of those I've read, this seems to fall somewhere in the middle, as a lot of it seems really clear and sounds fun, but also overcomplicated and messy to actually play. But the number one thing that jumped out to me in this rulebook was the tone. Part of what has always stopped me from reading entire wargaming manuals is just how dry and technical they are, and while this version is still very rules heavy, I found it was written in a far more casual and almost flowery way. There's a lot of little asides and sarcastic lines sprinkled throughout this as a whole, as it feels like it's taking itself a lot less seriously than most recent iterations. A lot of the content feels like more suggestions and guidelines as opposed to hard and fast rules, and this is backed up by how they talk about it. There's a lot more suggestions of changing and adapting rules to fit your armies, tables, or just preferences. And while most rule sets will be sure to have a forward or conclusion that encourages this as a game, in this it feels like they really push that idea before anything else. So now that we've talked about the rules have, let's talk about what they don't. While the rulebook doesn't have specific unit details, that's pretty standard. However, this one does actually go a step further than most by giving some generic rules for how points are allocated, so you can extrapolate them for yourself if you don't have access to the official ones through other books. But what it really lacked was context. Throughout the book, there's a lot of little asides about how different races and factions behave, but they're generally pretty generic fantasy tropes, and there's no background to the setting or armies. Also, there's nothing about the hobby side of building and painting terrain and models. However, that doesn't mean the box doesn't have that. It's just all over here. There's a little book about how to paint your models, which is basic, but I could see it being helpful for beginners, and it shows some lovely color schemes. However, everything else is in the battle book. This thing is bigger than the actual rulebook and includes everything from terrain and modeling guides, game modes, tournament help, and most importantly, tons and tons of pictures, artwork, and fluff for every army and faction in the game. This is an amazing thing to look through, and I've barely cracked the surface. Together, these two books probably match up pretty well to most recent manuals, but I do kind of like the idea of these things being separate, as I feel like it makes them both more accessible for the people who prefer one thing over the other. So to end off talking about rules, let's compare this to some other rule sets, starting with other rank and flank games. I haven't actually played any of these, but I did teach myself the rules for a couple, including the Lord of the Rings War of the Ring game. And going back to it now, it honestly reminds me a lot of this edition's rule set. However, I do feel that the War of the Ring is actually a lot more clear and comprehensive here than Warhammer Fantasy, which I suppose does make sense as it was released far further in the future by the same company. Then there's A Song of Ice and Fire by Cool Minis or Not, and it is quite different. It's got a lot less rules, but I still find it kind of frustrating and struggle to get my mind around it. Also, looking at the difference in sizes for these rulebooks, especially when you compare just how much are dedicated to lore and stats. I'm not necessarily saying one is better, but that's a big difference for such similar things. And speaking of different sizes, for one last rank and file comparison, I decided to download One Page Rules Age of Fantasy Regiments rule set, as it seemed like a good alternative as well. And I feel like if I were actually to play a rank and flank game, it may actually be this one. It's just so much simpler than all of the rest, yet it still feels like it maintains the same spirit. For instance, this is the entire rule set for movement, and comparing that to all of this is nuts. It's simple that there's still a lot of depth, and I feel like it accomplishes at least 90% of what others do with a fraction of the rule set. And so, before we continue to talk about the elephant in the room, I just wanted to congratulate my patron John on finishing up an awesome unit of Haradrim Raiders for this month's Patreon painting contest. I love these models, and they look awesome in the colors he chose. John has made some really cool alternative models for the Lord of the Rings in the past that are really out there, and I love seeing his creativity in our little group. So a big congrats to you again, and thank you for all my patrons for your continued support. And if any of you want to get into our little community and help support me and the channel to grow, hop over onto Patreon. And if you do it soon, I'll even send you some fancy dice, so think about it. But yes, Age of Sigmar 3rd Edition. While it isn't a rank and flank game, it is Games Workshop's successor to Warhammer Fantasy. I hadn't played Age of Sigmar before, but I was really sold on the new Dominion box set, and so I did order it. But I haven't actually gotten yet at the time of the recording, so I was really excited to see that Games Workshop actually did a really great thing by including the core rules for the game for free online. However, they did this in an incredibly roundabout way. Firstly, there's no advertising at all about this on the main site or the Warhammer community page. And to actually get to it, it's not on either of those, but on a designated Age of Sigmar site that you have to find through the community site. And once you're on there, you actually even can't just download or view them. You have to enter your email and have it sent to you. It's so close to being a great thing, but really fumbles there, and I feel like it's a huge deterrent for people if they're new to the game and looking to just learn about it. Anyways, while reading through these rules, something struck me. While it's obviously a very different game, the bones of Warhammer Fantasy are all still there. Other than the rank and flank difference, the actual basic structure is honestly not very different, which makes me wonder why all those babies were crying about what a big change it was. Regardless of the specific rules, the biggest difference for me is the presentation and tone, as reading the rules you'd really think that all of the fun had been sucked right out. The presentation is very clean cut and professionally done, but it's cold, and what pictures there are all from the one box set, which feels kind of uninspired. I know the full book has a lot of pictures and art, but still, this is what a lot of new people might be having for their first experience, and it's not very inviting. As for the rules themselves, they are incredibly technical and almost feel like they're written by a lawyer, as all of the personal touches are gone in favor of totally unquestionable detail, which I do get for the sake of tournament and official play, but it just ain't fun to read. Last thing that really stuck out to me in this was the insistence on using only GW products. It specifically tells you to use exclusively GW models, boards, terrain, and everything, without any guide or recommendation to build and create your own, which is a real shame and a direct contrast to the older stuff, which really does encourage you to be creative. And with that, that's enough about rules. So to finish off the paperwork, the box also comes with a roster sheet, reference sheet, and profile cards for the models in the box. And the very last thing before the models is these punch-out cards. They represent effects and such in game and do feel quite nice. Also, they include these papercraft buildings. Materials do feel really nice, and I love that they have separate windows, doors, posters, and more to add as extra details to further customize them. It's a great addition. I kind of wish they would bring this kind of stuff back, as it would help to get some terrain in the boxes without massively increasing the budget. And so let's finally look at the models. In the box, you get 20 Saurus Warriors, 32 Skinks with bows, 12 Bretonnian Knights, and 24 Bretonnian Bowmen, and straight out of the bat, the difference between these guys and the more recent models are simply night and day. The detail is fairly shallow, and there isn't much variety, with all the Saurus and Knights sharing the exact same body, and the Bowmen being only single pieces with only 2 variants for each. The push-fit bits even don't sit all that nice, with lots of gaps and tons of mold lines. Also, a big thing I noticed was there are no heroes in this box at all, not even command models for the individual units. I did get over this a little bit when I read the rules and saw that you don't technically need these, I don't think, but it still feels kind of disappointing, especially considering that the box clearly has 2 awesome looking characters right front and center that just aren't represented at all in the box. I guess that'll just have to be some conversions down the line for me, so let me know if you'd be interested in seeing that. But with all that said, they are really endearing, and I'm excited to get to work on them one day. I have a whole bunch of plans and ideas for them, but I think I'm mainly going to be splitting them up. I plan on using some of them to create little retro Warkai warbands on round bases, and keeping the rest to remain on squares and paint them up all in that insanely vibrant box art style. And so, having looked at all of this, is this the best GW box set ever? No, I don't think it is. Other boxes have better models, or more terrain, better rules, or even just better games. But I love having this around, as it feels like an awesome window into another period of the wargaming hobby. And while I was around at the time, I wasn't anywhere near close to learning what the whole Warhammer thing was yet. So it's a great way to kind of experience a bit of the hobby's history. And so thank you all for joining me on this little adventure back in time. I have a bunch of ideas for stuff to do with these, so let me know what you'd like to see, or if there's anything else you'd like to hear me ramble on about. But for now, thank you all, and be sure to like, comment, check me out over Patreon, Instagram, Twitter, and of course, subscribe and ring the bell, as I have a bunch of new content coming. And so, I'm Anders, and have a good one, everyone. Now it gets here. We'll do something with this. Let me know. For now, have a good one.